Hello, my friends. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a new horror story. I had been driving for hours through the back roads of Vermont, snow piling up on my windshield wipers, the world outside reduced to an endless white blur. I was heading to a small cabin I had rented for the winter, just me, the mountains, and the promise of solitude. I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to escape the chaos of city life. I didn't know that peace can be a lie and solitude can be a trap. The cabin was even more remote than the listing suggested. There were no neighbors for miles, and the road leading up to it was barely maintained, already slick with ice. When I finally arrived, the place looked abandoned but solid. Stone chimney, thick wooden beams, a fireplace that smelled faintly of soot and pine. The snow outside was pristine, untouched except for the tracks leading to the front door. I assumed the previous caretaker had been there recently. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound. The wind rattled the shutters, and occasionally a tree branch would scrape against the roof. I slept with the fire crackling, imagining the snow outside insulating me from the world. But when I woke at 3 in the morning, something was wrong. The snow outside the window had been disturbed. Footprints led from the tree line to the cabin's porch. They were long, narrow, almost human, but not quite. The spacing was uneven, the impressions too deep in some places, too shallow in others. I stared at them, frozen, heart pounding, before convincing myself it had to be a deer or a large animal. Over the next few days, odd things began to happen. I would put objects down in one place and find them elsewhere. Chairs slightly turned, books open to random pages, small scratches on the wooden floor. At first, I thought it was exhaustion. I was alone, tired from driving and clearing snow. But the feeling of being watched grew heavier with each passing day. I could sense eyes on me, even when no one was there. By the 5th night, the storm hit in full force. Snow whipped against the cabin, and the wind howled like it was alive. I stayed near the fireplace, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, reaching toward me. Around midnight, I heard movement outside, footsteps crunching in the deep snow. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, shining it into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved at the tree line. Too tall, too thin to be human, it swayed slightly, almost like it was gliding over the snow. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I saw the tracks again. They had multiplied, circling the cabin, forming patterns in the snow I didn't understand. Loops, spirals, lines intersecting at impossible angles. They led nowhere and everywhere at once, as if whatever was making them had no need to leave. I felt a rising panic, realizing that I was being observed by something that had been learning me for days. On the 7th night, the presence made itself more obvious. I woke to the feeling of someone, or something, standing just outside the bedroom door. I froze, holding my breath. The air in the cabin had grown colder, thick, pressing down on my chest. I dared not move. My flashlight lay on the floor, where I had left it on the dresser. I reached for it slowly, and when I turned it on, the beam caught something at the edge of the hall. A tall, thin figure, faceless, gliding slightly above the floor. I screamed and it vanished. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt like movement outside. Shadows danced where none should be. I barricaded the doors and windows, but it didn't matter. Whatever was out there didn't need doors or windows to get in. I began talking to it, pleading, threatening, promising to leave if it would only let me be. It never responded. I knew it could hear me. I knew it was learning me. I tried to leave on the 10th day. I dug my truck out of the snow and tried to start it, but the battery was dead. I checked the cell signal. None. The storm had cut me off completely. I was trapped in the snow with something patient, something watching, something that didn't follow the rules of this world. That night, I saw more figures outside the cabin, 5 of them, maybe more, gliding over the snow in silence. They didn't make footprints. Their forms were featureless, impossibly thin, swaying slightly in unison. I tried to record them on my phone, but the screen went black whenever I pointed it at them. I couldn't escape, couldn't hide. The air seemed heavier, thicker, like the cold had weight. By the 12th night, I was beyond terrified. I barricaded the doors and windows, sitting in the corner of the living room with a fireplace poker in hand. I whispered to them, begged them, told them I would leave if they let me. Nothing. Then I noticed prints inside the cabin, wet and slushy, leading from the back hallway to the living room, then stopping halfway. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationalize it. The isolation was no longer peaceful. It was a prison. I finally managed to start the truck the next morning. I drove down the mountain road as fast as I could, snow crunching under the tires. I didn't look back, but I felt it. The presence in the snow, patient and watching. Even now, weeks later, I feel it when the wind whistles through the trees or when snow falls silently outside. Then came the letter. No return address. Inside was a photograph of the cabin at night, windows glowing faintly, snow stretching around it. And in the snow, I could see the figures, tall, thin, faceless, swaying in unison. At the bottom of the photograph, scrawled in jagged black ink, were the words, "We never left." I haven't returned to the mountains. I avoid snow, forests, and isolation whenever possible. But every winter, when the nights grow long and the wind bites at my skin, I feel them again. I know they are out there, waiting. Winter is no longer silent. It watches, it waits, and it does not forgive those who wander alone. I didn't even want to buy a house. That's the part that still sticks with me. I wasn't ready, not financially, not mentally, not emotionally. But when you've spent 10 years in a cramped apartment with neighbors who scream at each other through the walls and stomp around like wrestling champions, the idea of owning a quiet place of your own feels like salvation. The house on Maple Crest Drive was the first one I toured. A pale blue ranch-style home with white trim, a wide front porch, and a freshly cut lawn that didn't fit the price tag. The agent, a chipper woman named Stacy, said the sellers wanted to move quickly. I should have asked why, but I was tired of apartment noise, tired of my life feeling stuck, and the house felt peaceful when I walked in. The air was cool. The hardwood floors were smooth and clean. The living room had a big window that flooded the place with sunlight. It felt safe, friendly. I signed the papers that same week. 3 days after moving in, I started noticing the house wasn't quiet at all. The first night was uneventful, though I remember waking up several times like someone had tapped my shoulder. The second night, I heard what I thought was the fridge making a strange sound, a hum followed by a short dragging noise. By the third night, the dragging grew longer, slower, almost thoughtful. I walked into the kitchen and saw nothing out of place. But the noise wasn't coming from the fridge. It was coming from the hallway, the long hallway connecting the bedrooms to the living room. The hallway was narrow and always darker than the rest of the house, even during the day. A place that seemed to swallow light instead of reflect it. I stood at one end of it and stared. Something shifted in the dark. I flicked the switch on, illuminating the wooden floor and beige walls. Nothing was there. I told myself it was settling noises. Old houses breathe, expand, contract. But the dragging didn't sound like a house breathing. It sounded like someone pulling their feet. The next morning, while unpacking, I found something odd in the hallway closet. It was a small patch of discolored drywall, low to the ground, maybe 2 feet up. I ran my fingers over it. The texture was slightly rougher, like it had been replaced or painted over in a hurry. Behind it, something tapped once. I jerked my hand back and stared at the drywall. My pulse sped up, and for a moment I felt stupid, standing there like a kid who expected a monster to jump out. But then the logical part of my brain reminded me that houses make all kinds of internal noises, pipes, framing, electrical wiring. Just because the tap lined up perfectly under my fingers didn't mean anything. Still, I closed the closet door. Over the next week, I caught myself avoiding the hallway altogether. I'd walk fast through it or take the long route through the kitchen just to get to my bedroom. At night, I kept my door closed, even though I'd never slept with it closed before. Something about that hallway made me feel exposed, like someone was standing just out of view. One night, around 2:40 a.m., a noise woke me. A voice. A whisper so faint I first thought it came from a dream. I lay still, listening. The whisper came again, drifting through the air. Soft. Slow. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone trying to get my attention. I sat up. The whispering stopped instantly. My room was silent, but the air felt heavy. Even the shadows seemed thicker, as if they'd shifted when I moved. I got up, opened my door a crack, and peered into the hallway. Pitch black. The whisper came again, not from the hallway, from behind me. I spun around. Nothing was there. My throat tightened. I flipped on the bedroom light. The whisper stopped immediately. The silence afterward was so complete, it felt like someone had pressed their face against mine and held their breath. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I called my mom. She told me to sage the house. My best friend told me to get a carbon monoxide detector. I bought the detector. It read normal levels. That same day, my next-door neighbor stopped me while I was taking out the trash. His name was Ron, an older guy with sunspots on his arms and a permanent squint that made him look suspicious of everything. "You're new," he said. "Yeah, I moved in last week." He nodded, his eyes drifting toward my house. "Everything all right in there?" It was the way he asked it, hesitant, cautious, that made me tense. Why wouldn't it be? He stared a little too long before answering. "No reason, just folks don't stay there long." My chest tightened. "Why? Is there something wrong with the house?" "Not the house," he said. "Something in it." Before I could ask what he meant, his wife called him from their porch, and he gave me a half-hearted wave before walking away. The next night, the dragging sound returned. This time, it was unmistakably coming from the hallway. I opened my bedroom door slowly, heart pounding. The sound paused as though it heard me, then continued. My breath hitched. Someone was dragging their feet down the hallway. I whispered to myself, "You are hearing things. You are stressed." But that lie disintegrated when I saw the floorboards bend, just slightly, one by one. As if someone heavy was walking toward my room, I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it. The dragging stopped right on the other side. Silence settled, the kind of silence that hums in your ears and crawls under your skin. Then the doorknob turned, slowly, deliberately. I staggered back. My lungs struggled to expand. The knob turned again, harder this time, then stopped. I didn't breathe for what felt like an entire minute. Finally, I reached for my phone, ready to call 911, when something strange happened. The house went still. Completely still. Like whatever was outside my door had stepped away. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The floorboards were quiet. The air was no longer cold. I told myself I imagined it. I told myself stress could induce hallucinations. I told myself anything that would let me sleep again. But the house knew better. A few days later, I decided to repaint the hallway. I wanted to make it brighter, less suffocating. As I moved furniture, I noticed something odd about the baseboards. A long scratch mark ran down one side, thin but deep, like a nail or knife had dragged across it. I crouched down and ran my finger over it. The drywall patch behind me tapped again. I jerked upright. The tap came a second time, a little louder. With shaking hands, I grabbed a screwdriver and began prying the drywall patch open. The plaster cracked. A piece crumbled inward. Behind the wall was a narrow cavity, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze into. My stomach lurched. I held my phone inside the hole and turned on the flashlight. What I saw made me freeze. Scratch marks covered the inside walls, thousands of them, layer over layer, some deep enough to pull chunks of plaster free. At the bottom of the cavity sat a small object, a single, dirty house key. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering so hard I felt it in my teeth. That night, the whispering didn't wait for 2:40 a.m. It started the moment I turned off the light, a soft murmur circling my bed, slipping beneath my blanket of logic and denial. The voice was closer now, too close. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the whisper crawled under my skin like it had been waiting for me to listen. I snapped on the lamp. The whisper stopped. I kept the lamp on until morning. The next day, I drove to the county office, determined to find out who lived in the house before me. The clerk looked up the records and told me something that made my stomach drop. The house had changed owners 8 times in 13 years. That wasn't normal. I asked if anyone had died there. He hesitated, then nodded. One. A man. About 6 years ago. What happened to him? He lowered his voice. He locked himself in one of the interior walls. They said he became confused, delusional. I felt the blood drain from my face. Locked himself inside? How? They found scratch marks, like he'd been trying to get out. My hands trembled. Do you know where in the house? He checked the file. A hallway cavity, next to a closet. I left without saying thank you. When I got home, the house felt wrong. Off. Like someone had been inside while I was gone. The air was colder. My bedroom door was open, even though I had closed it. The drywall cavity looked wider, as if someone had tugged at the plaster. I tried to convince myself to leave, pack a bag, and stay in a hotel. But exhaustion weighed down my limbs. I sat on the edge of my bed just to breathe. The whisper came immediately. Only this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a voice, a man's voice, clear, close, right beside my ear. Let me out. I screamed and fell off the bed. The voice grew louder, angrier. The walls shook. Books fell off shelves. My bedroom door slammed shut on its own. The voice roared through the room. Let me out! The drywall by the closet split open, and a hand reached through, pale, thin, fingernails torn. Blood dried into the creases of the skin. The hand clawed at the air like it was searching for me. I scrambled back, hitting the opposite wall. The cavity tore wider. A face appeared. Sunken eyes, lips cracked, skin stretched tight over bone. It wasn't fully human anymore, not after whatever had happened inside those walls. It stared straight at me with a desperation so thick it tasted like metal in the air. Let me out, it repeated, voice breaking. I bolted for the window, unlocked it, and climbed out onto the lawn. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove straight to my brother's house and stayed there for a week. When I finally worked up the courage to return with police and a contractor, the cavity in the wall was empty. No scratches, no key, no hand. Just smooth drywall, like nothing ever happened. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The house sold again 3 months later. I didn't warn the new owners. Maybe I should have, but I don't think it would have mattered. Some houses aren't haunted. Some houses are hungry. And Maple Crest Drive has been hungry for a long, long time. I used to love Christmas. I loved the lights, the music, the warmth that seemed to settle over every neighborhood in the country. But now, when December comes, I feel that same cold dread crawl up my spine. I can't hear carolers without feeling my throat tighten, and I can't look at a Christmas tree without remembering what happened the year my family rented a cabin in Minnesota. The year I learned that something walks the woods during Christmas week, something that isn't human and never was. People always laugh when I tell them it happened on Christmas Eve, as if the holiday itself makes horror impossible. But I swear to you, everything I'm about to tell you is true. My mom had found the cabin on a rental app, one of those homey, rustic places that looked like a postcard. Pine trees, gentle snowdrifts, a frozen lake out back. She thought it would be the perfect Christmas getaway. My dad had just recovered from surgery, and we all wanted a quiet holiday after a chaotic year. The moment we pulled up the long driveway, I felt something off. The cabin was pretty enough. Dark wood exterior, warm lights glowing through frosted windows, but the woods surrounding it were unnaturally still. Quiet in a way I've never heard before. No birds, no wind brushing branches, just a thick, heavy silence that made my skin crawl. Mom slapped my arm as if sensing my hesitation. "Don't be dramatic," she said, grabbing her suitcase. "It's peaceful." But peace doesn't feel like something watching you. And from the moment I stepped out of the car, that's exactly what it felt like. Like unseen eyes were tracking every breath we took. Inside, the cabin was cozy in a slightly outdated way. Plaid couches, shelves lined with porcelain snowmen, a stone fireplace that smelled faintly of pine resin. There was even a Christmas tree set up in the corner, strangely old-fashioned with real candles clipped to the branches instead of lights. I told Mom that was a fire hazard, but she waved it off. "People have been doing that for centuries," she said. "It's charming." Sure, maybe on the surface, but something about that tree bothered me. Maybe it was the smell. Too old, like the tree had been cut weeks ago. Or maybe it was because of the way I swore I saw something shift among the branches. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. Dad was tired from the drive and went to lie down. Mom took out ingredients to start dinner. My little sister Emma explored the loft upstairs. I tried to relax, but I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something standing in the snow. The first strange thing happened around 6 p.m., when the sun had fully set. Emma ran down the stairs, her face pale. "There's someone outside," she said. Mom told her it was probably a deer, but Emma shook her head violently. No, it wasn't a deer. It was tall. Really tall. Dad and I went outside with flashlights, crunching through thin layers of snow. The beam of my flashlight moved between trees. "See?" Dad said. "Nothing." But just as he said it, I noticed something in the distance. A figure, very tall, standing between two pines, too still, too straight. It didn't look like a person, not really. There was something wrong about the proportions. Too long, too thin, and the face. I didn't even get a good look. Just a pale blur turned toward us. Dad raised his flashlight, but before the light hit the figure, it vanished. Not walked away, not ducked. It was simply gone. Dad laughed it off. Optical illusion, dark woods. Your mind fills in shapes. But I didn't believe that for a second. And from the way Dad kept glancing back as we walked to the cabin, I think he didn't believe it either. Inside, Mom had set the real candles on the tree alight, despite my protests. Their warm flicker cast moving shadows around the living room. Too many shadows. At dinner, we tried to act normal, but the atmosphere felt off. Every so often, one of us would stop talking, listening for something we couldn't identify. A faint scraping, a soft tapping, a whisper of movement. When we finished dinner, I offered to take the trash outside. The cold air slapped me in the face. As I walked to the bins near the tree line, I heard something crunch in the snow about 10 feet away. Slow footsteps, deliberate. I turned around expecting a deer. It wasn't a deer. A tall shape stood between the trees again, and this time, I saw its face clearly. It was stretched, too long, too narrow, with deep-set eyes that reflected the faint light from the cabin. Its skin looked grayish, almost frost-bitten, like something dead. Thin lips peeled back into a smile so wide it made my stomach twist. The thing tilted its head, studying me. Something inside me screamed to run. I backed away slowly, refusing to turn my back. The creature took one long step forward, then another. I almost tripped over my own feet, sprinting back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. Dad asked what happened, but when I told him, he didn't laugh this time. His face went pale. He locked all the doors and windows, drawing every curtain. That should have made me feel better. But it didn't. Because when I walked into the living room, I noticed something wrong with the Christmas tree. One of the candles was out. But I knew, absolutely knew, that every candle had been lit minutes earlier. The next few hours were tense. Dad kept pacing from window to window. Mom tried to keep things positive, but every time she forced a smile, her hands trembled. Around midnight, Emma complained she was cold, even though the fireplace was blazing. I felt it too, a creeping coldness that had nothing to do with drafts, like the warmth was being drained from the air itself. Then the scratching began. Faint at first, soft, almost like branches brushing the cabin walls. But then it got louder. Long, dragging scratches moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Mom covered Emma's ears while Dad grabbed the fire poker. I stood frozen, staring at the front door. The scratching moved there, slow, deliberate strokes, like whatever stood outside was tracing the wood. Dad whispered, "Don't make a sound." For a moment, everything went quiet. Then something pressed against the door, a shadow, tall, too tall. The doorknob twitched once, twice, then began turning. Dad grabbed the knob from inside, trying to hold it still. Whatever was on the other side turned harder. I heard the metal strain. Mom was on the phone with the police, but service had disappeared. No signal, no connection, nothing. And then came the voice. Not from outside. From inside the cabin. It came from the direction of the Christmas tree. A whisper. A voice that sounded like it was trying to imitate human speech but didn't quite understand how. It said my name. Slowly. Distorted. Stretched. My mom gasped. Emma started crying. Dad shouted, "Stay away from the tree!" But it was too late. I turned toward the branches just in time to see something shift inside them. A pale hand, long, bone thin, slid out between the needles. Then another. Then a face pushed forward. The same elongated face I'd seen in the woods, hiding within the branches like a monstrous ornament. I screamed. The candles all blew out at once, plunging the room into darkness. Dad yelled for us to run. I grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the hallway. Mom was right behind us. Dad swung the fire poker at the tree, but something shot out of the branches, one of those thin white arms, and grabbed him by the throat. Dad dropped the poker, clawing at the creature's grip. Mom screamed his name. I dragged Emma down the hallway, shoving her into the master bedroom. Mom followed, locking the door behind us. Dad's screams echoed through the cabin, then suddenly stopped. For a long time, we didn't move. Then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Wrong. They moved down the hallway, stopping right outside the bedroom door. Mom pressed her hand over Emma's mouth to keep her quiet. I felt myself shaking uncontrollably. A long fingernail scraped slowly down the wood of the door. Then, the handle turned. Mom shoved a dresser in front of the door as it rattled, shaking violently. The creature slammed against it once, twice, but the heavy furniture held. Eventually, the banging stopped. But we didn't dare move, not for hours. I think the creature eventually left, or maybe the sun scared it off. All I know is that when dawn finally crept through the curtains, the cabin was silent. When we opened the door, Dad was lying on the floor of the hallway. His eyes were open, his skin was pale, but there wasn't a single mark on him. Mom screamed and dropped to her knees. Emma sobbed uncontrollably. I stood there frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. Dad hadn't been torn apart. He hadn't been injured at all. It looked like he'd just died, like something had sucked the life out of him in an instant. We didn't pack. We didn't call the owner. We didn't wait for an explanation. We just left. And every Christmas since then, I've felt it. That same cold, that same heaviness, that same presence watching me through dark windows. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm decorating the tree, I hear a faint scratching, like long fingernails on wood, like something thin and pale is tracing the outline of my front door, remembering exactly where it found me, remembering that it's not finished. I had been looking forward to this cruise for months. A week on the Caribbean aboard the Elysian Tide, a luxury liner boasting pools, lounges, and everything a traveler could imagine. I had my own balcony cabin on the 15th deck, and I pictured mornings with coffee in the sun, afternoons wandering the ship, and evenings gazing at the ocean, the horizon glowing in twilight. I had no idea how quickly everything would turn wrong. The first 2 days passed as expected. The ship gleamed under the Florida sun. Passengers laughed, staff moved efficiently, and I explored the deck pools and lounges. Everything seemed perfect, but I noticed tiny oddities I initially dismissed. Some passengers moved unnaturally slowly, as if gliding. Crew members sometimes vanished mid-task and appeared elsewhere, always with the same polite smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. I told myself it was fatigue or my imagination. On the second night, I awoke to a scratching sound at my balcony door. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, sure it was the wind, but the taps continued in a deliberate rhythm. I cautiously approached, peering through the glass. Nothing. The balcony was empty. I locked the door again, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Then, soft whispers reached my ears from the cabin's hallway, voices repeating my name. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, hoping it was just a nightmare. By the third night, things escalated. I'd stepped out onto the balcony to feel the ocean breeze and saw movement beneath the water, a dark, humanoid shape gliding just below the surface. I blinked. It disappeared instantly, leaving only the gentle lap of waves. Later in the corridor, I glimpsed a figure I had seen at dinner standing motionless at the end of the hall. Their head tilted unnaturally, their mouth stretched into a grotesque, silent grin. I slammed my cabin door and hid under the covers, shivering. On the fourth day, the anomalies continued. Some passengers moved oddly, with jerky, puppet-like motions, staring ahead blankly, unresponsive. Their faces seemed pale, almost waxen. I avoided them and stayed in the bustling areas, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I walked onto the deck and noticed more movement in the water, shapes, dark and elongated, gliding beneath the hull. Faces appeared, pressed briefly against the glass or waterline, mouths opening and closing without sound. By the fifth night, I could no longer remain in my cabin. The hallways seemed to stretch unnaturally, doors opening into rooms I had never seen. Some rooms were partially flooded, water pooling across the floor. Faces pressed upward beneath the surface, mouths opening in silent screams. The ship itself felt alive, rearranging itself in ways that defied reason. I stayed on upper decks, hoping open space would keep me safe, but shadows moved at the edges of my vision. That night, I saw a boy standing alone on a promenade, wet, hair plastered to his face, eyes black and endless. He stared at me, smiled unnaturally, and vanished. More shapes moved beneath the water, gliding toward the hull. They didn't swim. They hunted. I felt my pulse spike. The Elysian Tide was no longer a ship. It was a predator. On the sixth night, the corridors twisted and turned impossibly. Stairwells descended farther than they should. Doors opened into flooded rooms filled with faces beneath the surface, mouths moving in silent pleas. I heard whispers calling my name, insistent, urgent. I realized the ship itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap me. I ran through corridors that looped back impossibly, doors opening into the same flooded rooms. I reached the main deck and leaped into a lifeboat, paddling frantically. Behind me, the ship towered impossibly, its decks twisting like a maze. Figures lined every railing, passengers and crew alike, staring, mouths moving in silent screams. The water churned, shadows rising and reaching for me. I paddled until exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed on a deserted island as dawn broke. Rescue eventually arrived, but authorities found no record of the Elysian Tide, no missing passengers, nothing. They dismissed my story as hallucination, stress, or trauma. But I know what I saw. I hear whispers in my dreams, feel eyes on me from shadows, see faces beneath water whenever I close my eyes. The ship is still out there, somewhere, waiting. I will never cruise again. Not ever. But it doesn't matter. The Elysian tide doesn't forget, it doesn't stop, and it doesn't forgive. I survived barely, but the memory of the ship and the terror it carried will never leave me. I can feel it in the wind, smell it in the sea, and one day it will come for me again. I know that when it does, I won't be able to run. The ocean is infinite, but the Elysian tide is patient. It hunts, it waits, and it remembers. I will never forget the faces beneath the water, the boy with the endless eyes, the corridors that twisted like living things. I survived, but the ship didn't. It is still out there, somewhere, drifting silently, watching, waiting, and it knows my name. Even now, years later, I hear faint whispers when I walk by water or in my sleep, and I know, without doubt, that the ship will return. And when it does, there will be no escape. I never believed small towns could hide anything truly terrifying until I moved to Willow Creek. I thought I wanted peace, a slower pace, friendly neighbors, clean air. What I didn't know was that some towns keep secrets. Some neighbors are not what they seem, and some things are better left undiscovered. I had rented a small house on the north side of Willow Creek for the summer. It was old, a little worn, but charming, with a wide porch and a backyard that ran into a line of trees. The town itself was quaint, seemingly normal. People waved, nodded, smiled politely. Everything looked perfectly safe. My next-door neighbor, a man named Gregory, lived alone. He was a tall man, thin, with pale skin that almost glowed in the sunlight. He was polite when we met, smiled, shook my hand, even invited me over for coffee. But there was something in his expression that unsettled me. His eyes didn't quite match his words. There was a sharpness there, a calculating edge, as if he could see right into me. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, explored the town, and tried to settle in. But even during the day, I felt watched. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the edges of my vision. Sometimes I would glance toward Gregory's yard and catch him staring, perfectly still. And when I looked directly, he would be doing something mundane, watering plants, fixing a fence. But the sense that he was observing me never left. On the fourth night, I began to hear noises. At first, it was subtle. The faint scrape of shoes on pavement outside, the soft click of a door closing. I assumed Gregory was just moving about his yard, but the sounds continued after I had gone to bed. They came in patterns that didn't make sense, deliberate in a way that made my stomach turn. And then came the whispers. I woke in the middle of the night to voices, faint but insistent, echoing from the space between my walls and the trees outside. I couldn't make out the words, just syllables, tones that sounded like my name, repeated over and over. My heart pounded. I turned on every light, checked every lock. The noises stopped when I entered the living room, but resumed immediately when I returned to bed. The following morning, I noticed something strange. Objects in my house had shifted. The coffee mug I had left on the kitchen counter was now on the table. The chair in the corner of the living room was rotated toward the window. At first, I tried to convince myself I had moved them and forgotten, but the feeling of being watched intensified, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I confronted Gregory that afternoon. He was in his yard, trimming a bush. "Hey," I called, "have you been around my house at night?" He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I stammered. "I keep hearing things, moving sounds, whispers. My voice trailed off. He smiled, polite and casual. "Sounds like an old house. You're probably just adjusting." I didn't believe him, but I didn't press. That night, the activity escalated. Whispers swirled around my bedroom, bouncing from wall to wall. Shadows moved unnaturally in the corners. Then came scratching at the windows, deliberate, slow, like claws dragging across glass. My door handle rattled and I knew someone was outside. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just stayed huddled under my blankets, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. The next day, I decided to investigate. I walked around the perimeter of my property, trying to find evidence of intrusion. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbances. Gregory's yard was immaculate, not a sign of a trespasser. But when I glanced at his house, I caught a flicker of movement at one of his windows. He was watching me. Always watching. That night, I could take it no longer. I left my lights on and sat in the living room with my phone, ready to call the police if anything happened. Hours passed. The house was silent. I started to relax, and then I saw him. Gregory. Standing outside my window, perfectly still, staring in. The streetlight behind him made him look almost unreal. His expression was calm, polite, but his eyes were fixated on me. My chest tightened. I grabbed the phone, but before I could dial, he disappeared. Just vanished. The following day, I tried to leave. I got in my car and headed toward the highway, but the road seemed wrong. Turns I had taken 100 times now led back toward my house. Shadows flitted along the tree line, always keeping pace. I drove faster, but it didn't matter. It was as if the town itself was bending to keep me inside, as if something had taken control. I returned home, terrified and exhausted. That night, the activity worsened. I could hear footsteps pacing the floor above me, though I lived alone. Doors creaked open and closed on their own. The whispers now had words I could almost make out. Come, stay, forever. I finally spoke to another neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, hoping for some explanation. Her hands shook as she spoke. Gregory, he's not right. He's been here a long time, longer than anyone should be. People try to ignore him, but he notices. He chooses. Chooses? I asked, voice trembling. Yes, she said. And when he chooses, they disappear. Some vanish for days, some never come back. The town pretends it's normal, but it isn't. And if you're too curious, too aware, he'll come for you. I realized then that it wasn't just Gregory. The house, the street, even the trees seemed to pulse with his presence. I couldn't leave, couldn't escape. Every attempt to drive away ended with the same result. Back at my house, back at his watchful gaze. Weeks passed. Sleep became impossible. I barely ate. Shadows followed me through the house, whispers echoing relentlessly. Objects moved without explanation, and always Gregory was there. Sometimes in the yard, sometimes glimpsed through a window, sometimes simply felt. Watching, waiting. One night, I woke to the sound of the front door creaking. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached. The light fell on him, Gregory, standing in the foyer, expression neutral, eyes dark, impossibly still. I froze. He tilted his head slightly, studying me as though I were a specimen. The whispers around me swelled, and the shadows grew thick and solid. I ran, not stopping, out the back door and into the woods behind my house. The path twisted unnaturally, leading me in circles. Shapes moved in the darkness, tall, featureless figures that glided silently, keeping pace with me. I tripped over roots, scraped my hands, my lungs burned, but I didn't dare look back. By dawn, I stumbled out of the trees and onto the street. My house was empty, silent, no signs of Gregory, no shadows. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel him, patient, waiting. He had chosen me, and no matter how far I ran, I would never be free. I moved cities, changed jobs, changed my number, but the presence followed. Shadows flicker in corners, whispers echo faintly in empty rooms, and objects shift when I'm not looking. I live with constant fear, knowing he is still there, waiting, intelligent, relentless. I write this as a warning. If you ever move near a town like Willow Creek, be cautious. Don't be curious about neighbors who seem too perfect. Don't wander near abandoned properties, and never ignore the feeling of being watched. Some things are patient, and some things are not human. Gregory is patient. He will wait for you to notice him, and once you do, once he has chosen you, There is no escape. I know this because I live it every day, and I fear the moment he comes to collect me fully, because then it will be too late for anyone. I was driving back from a photography trip in upstate New York when my car started making a sound I've never heard before. A low, grinding whine that gradually escalated into a violent shaking. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping it was just a temporary glitch, but the engine died completely. I looked around and saw nothing but thick woods, the kind that pressed in on you from both sides of the road, and a faint glow far ahead. As I trudged through the mud toward the light, I realized it was a town, or what appeared to be a town. The sign read, "Hallows End," in faded, peeling letters. The place seemed deserted. The few lights that flickered were weak and yellow, barely illuminating the cracked pavement. I found a small diner first. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, and inside, the air smelled like cold coffee and dust. One man sat at a corner booth, hunched over, and looked up as I entered. His eyes were hollow, and his skin had a strange gray pallor, but he smiled politely. "New in town?" he asked. "Yes," I said, trying to mask the unease curling in my stomach. "My car broke down." "You'll find a motel a little further down Main Street," he said, voice flat like he was reading from a script. "Room 3 is empty. They don't like strangers much, but it's yours for the night." I thanked him, though his words felt heavy, almost warning me. The motel was a simple aging building with a flickering neon vacancy sign. The receptionist, a thin, sharp-eyed woman, handed me the key with a nod but said nothing. I followed her gaze as I entered my room and felt for the first time the creeping sensation that I was being watched. The room smelled faintly of mold, the carpet worn thin in places, and the window looked out onto a parking lot surrounded by trees that seemed too close, their branches clawing toward the building. I unpacked quickly, telling myself it was just my imagination. Exhaustion pulled me into sleep almost immediately. I awoke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a soft knocking, coming from inside the room. At first, I thought it was the radiator, but the sound moved, circling me, echoing faintly off the walls. Then came a whisper, so quiet I barely caught it at first. "Eli." My name, drawn out and guttural, not spoken but felt, pressing into my mind like a weight. I froze, convinced it was a dream, yet the shadows in the corners of the room shifted, stretching and curling as though alive. The next morning, I tried to leave. I had to make sure my car could be fixed, but as I drove toward the edge of town, the streets didn't match what I had seen earlier. Intersections twisted unnaturally, roads looped back on themselves, trees leaned inward over the asphalt, blocking the way. And somewhere, just at the edge of my vision, I felt it watching. Something tall, impossibly thin, faceless, always there, always still. Over the next few days, the events escalated. I stayed at the motel, but I was never alone. Items in the room moved without explanation. The dresser drawers opened, then slammed shut. My backpack slid across the floor while I slept. The air grew heavy, thick, suffocating, and the whispers became words, phrases I couldn't understand but felt in the pit of my stomach. Sleep became impossible. Shadows bent into forms, faces that appeared briefly then vanished, limbs that moved in ways they couldn't. I began talking to the locals, hoping to find some explanation. Most avoided me, whispering behind doors. One man, who introduced himself as Harold, finally spoke. He said, "They don't like outsiders. Hallows End. It doesn't want visitors. If it notices you, it doesn't forget." I didn't understand. "What doesn't want visitors?" I asked. "The town. It's alive," he said. His voice dropped to a whisper. "It feeds on those it traps. Fear, desperation. That's its nourishment. If you've seen it, you can't leave." I laughed nervously. Superstitions, I told myself. But that night, the whispers came again, louder, insistent, forming a chorus that filled the room. I could hear shapes moving in the corners, twisting, stretching, always watching. One shadow in particular, the tall, faceless one, leaned in impossibly close, and I could feel its presence pressing against my chest. My heart raced. I understood finally that the town itself was not just haunted. It was alive. I found a notebook hidden beneath the floorboards in the room. The previous occupant had written frantically, "I tried to leave. Roads twist. Streets return to the same place. The people, they're not people. Not really. I hear the whispers in my sleep. The shadows watch. They know when I wake. They know when I sleep. I am trapped. If you are reading this, don't stay. It notices, and once it notices, there is no escape." There, I couldn't ignore it. I packed my things and tried to drive out again. The forest closed in. The roads bent unnaturally, looping back on themselves. I saw the faceless figure standing silently in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes. It vanished. I tried again. The streets rearranged themselves. The forest seemed to press in from every side. I began to understand that distance and speed didn't matter. The town was patient, deliberate, and it had marked me. I began noticing the townspeople differently. Their eyes followed me too long, then darted away. Smiles were slow, almost mechanical. Occasionally, I would see the faceless figure in place of someone, its height bending the body unnaturally, limbs too long, a head tilted in ways that made me shiver. The town was patient. It didn't rush. It observed. It waited. It fed. One night, I confronted it. I stayed awake deliberately, watching the shadows creep along the walls. The tall, faceless figure appeared in the corner of the room, stretching impossibly, limbs bending at impossible angles. Its voice entered my mind as though the room itself spoke. "You should not be here." I didn't mean to," I stammered. "You belong," it said. And in that moment, I realized that I already did. The town didn't need to attack me physically. It only needed to watch, to feed on my fear, and I was already trapped. The following days became a blur. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. Time lost meaning. Shadows moved constantly, dancing along walls and furniture. Whispers rose and fell like waves, a chorus in a language older than the town itself. I tried leaving, but every road led back to Hallow's End. Every turn returned me to the same streets. Even when I thought I had escaped, the faceless figure appeared in mirrors, windows, puddles, even darkened screens. I eventually moved far away, hundreds of miles from Hallow's End, thinking that distance would protect me. I was wrong. The shadows appeared in corners of my apartment. Whispers filled the silence. Doors opened when I knew they were closed. Objects vanished, only to return hours later in impossible places. I caught glimpses of the faceless figure at the edge of my vision. I could feel it, patient, inevitable, always watching. I've come to accept the truth. Towns like Hallow's End do not just hide secrets. They claim people, they mark them, and once they claim you, the town waits patiently, inevitably, to reclaim its due. I am marked. I am already part of it. No matter how far I run, I will never escape. One day, it will come for me, and I will belong to Hallow's End forever. No one who sees it ever truly leaves. I have learned that. The fear never ends, and neither does the watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more terrifying tales.